A reactor doesn't care whose name is on the org chart. That's the first thing you learn as a control room operator, and the last thing some people in this industry ever fully accept. I've spent 33 years at Cardinal Bend Nuclear Station learning the specific, patient language a reactor speaks through its instrumentation, the small deviations that mean nothing, and the small deviations that mean everything, and the discipline it takes to tell the difference every single shift, for decades, without ever once letting your guard down because nothing's gone wrong yet. My name is Samuel Whitfield. Senior Reactor Operations Supervisor, Cardinal Bend Unit 2, 33 years of licensed service, not one reportable safety event on my watch in all that time. My younger brother Curtis has worked at this same plant for 19 years, the last 4 of them as Chief Digital Systems Officer, and this is the story of the 11 weeks where his ambition and my caution nearly cost this plant something neither of us could have taken back. Curtis is 7 years younger than me, and I want to be honest that some of what happened between us that year had roots going back decades before either of us ever set foot in a control room. Our father worked construction on this very plant in the 1970s, and I think some part of Curtis spent his whole career trying to outrun being known, at Cardinal Bend, as Sam Whitfield's little brother, the operator's kid who went into computer engineering instead of the licensing track, the one who came back with a systems degree and climbed a different ladder than the one everyone assumed he'd take. I don't say that to excuse what happened. I say it because I think understanding it matters, and because I've had a year now to sit with exactly how much of my own resentment toward him was really about the plant, and how much of it was older and more complicated than that. Our father died the year Curtis finished his systems engineering degree, and I remember, at the funeral, an older foreman who'd worked with Dad in the 70s telling Curtis, with what I'm sure he meant as warm nostalgia, that it was a shame he hadn't followed his brother into the control room instead of playing with computers. I watched something close off in Curtis's face that day that I don't think ever fully reopened, not toward the plant, and maybe not entirely toward me either, however much neither of us ever said so directly. Curtis championed a system called CoreSight, an AI-driven predictive maintenance platform monitoring vibration signatures, thermal profiles, and flow dynamics across Unit 2's primary coolant system, designed to flag early degradation in critical rotating equipment, pumps, valves, turbine components, well before traditional scheduled maintenance intervals would have caught the same issues. It was, by every reasonable engineering measure, a genuine advancement, and I want to be clear that I supported its installation from the beginning, sitting on the plant safety review committee that approved its initial deployment. Cardinal Bend's insurance underwriters have been pushing for exactly this kind of predictive capability for years, and CoreSight's rollout, in its first 18 months, caught 3 legitimate equipment issues that traditional inspection schedules likely wouldn't have identified until they'd become considerably more serious. I was, if anything, one of the system's more visible internal advocates in those first 18 months, a fact that made everything that followed harder to sit with once I understood my own part in trusting a dashboard I should have kept questioning more carefully. It's going to make this plant safer and more efficient at the same time, Sam, Curtis told me, the week the system reached full operational deployment across Unit 2, standing in the same control room our father had once walked us through as boys, pointing out gauges neither of us fully understood yet. You've spent 33 years reading instrumentation by instinct. CoreSight reads 40,000 data points a second across systems no human instinct was ever built to monitor continuously. I don't doubt the engineering, Curtis. I doubt the pressure you're under to make it look perfect. He didn't have a response to that worth remembering, and I regret, now, that I said it as an accusation rather than a warning, because within a year, it turned out to be exactly the thing that mattered most. What I understood only partially, at the time, was the specific financial pressure sitting on Curtis's shoulders that year. Cardinal Bend's parent utility was 11 months from a rate case hearing before the State Utility Commission, a proceeding that would determine whether the company could pass a significant capital investment recovery onto ratepayers, contingent, in part, on demonstrated operational efficiency improvements from exactly the kind of predictive maintenance technology CoreSight represented. Unplanned maintenance downtime, in the specific language of the regulatory filing Curtis was responsible for supporting, needed to show a measurable, defensible decline compared to the plant's 5-year historical baseline. CoreSight, in its first year, had been calibrated conservatively, the same way Sentrywell had been calibrated on an offshore platform I'd later hear about from an old drilling contact of mine, flagging borderline vibration signatures for manual inspection at a rate that, while safety appropriate, was producing more scheduled maintenance stops than the rate case filing could comfortably characterize as significant efficiency improvement. 3 months before the hearing, Curtis's engineering team quietly raised CoreSite's vibration anomaly threshold on Unit 2's primary coolant pumps by 12%, a change presented internally, in a memo I saw only much later, as recalibration to reduce false positive maintenance stops based on 18 months of accumulated operational data, language that sounded, on its face, like the same reasonable statistical refinement any maturing monitoring system goes through. What that 12% threshold change actually did, in practice, was push a specific category of early-stage bearing degradation signature, the kind produced by a newer pump vendor's components that Cardinal Bend had begun installing during a partial equipment refresh 18 months earlier, below CoreSite's flagging sensitivity entirely. The new vendor's pumps, it turned out, produced a subtly different vibration signature during early bearing wear than the legacy equipment CoreSite's original model had been trained on, a distinction the system's engineering team either hadn't fully identified or hadn't weighted heavily enough when approving the threshold adjustment. I noticed Pump 2B on Unit 2's primary coolant loop behaving strangely in April, 4 months before the rate case hearing. On a routine manual inspection round I still walk twice a week despite CoreSite's continuous monitoring, the same stubborn habit that runs through every operator I respect in this business. I remember stopping mid-stride near the pump housing, one hand resting against the warm steel casing the way I'd rested a hand against 1,000 pumps across 3 decades, feeling for the vibration through my palm the way some of the old-timers taught me back when I was young enough to think that habit was slightly ridiculous. The vibration wasn't dramatic, nothing that would have alarmed a less experienced ear, but it carried a particular harmonic quality, a faint irregular pulse beneath the pump's normal operating hum, that I'd heard exactly once before, 11 years earlier, on a different pump, in the early stages of a bearing race developing microscopic pitting that eventually required an unplanned outage to correct before it progressed further. I filed a manual concern report the same day, flagging Pump 2B for expedited inspection, describing the harmonic irregularity in as much technical detail as I could put into words that would mean something to an engineer who hadn't personally heard it, and I checked CoreSite's own dashboard reading for the same equipment out of simple professional curiosity. The system showed Pump 2B's vibration signature comfortably within normal operating parameters, a smooth green line sitting well inside its tolerance band, a reading that, I now understand, reflected the exact threshold adjustment Curtis's team had approved 3 months earlier, filtering out precisely the kind of subtle, novel signature degradation I was hearing with my own trained ear, but that the recalibrated model had been tuned, deliberately, not to flag as urgent. I brought the discrepancy to Curtis directly, the way I'd brought 100 other operational concerns to 100 other engineers over 3 decades, expecting the conversation to go the way those conversations usually go, a shared review of the data, a mutual landing on whatever the evidence actually supported. The kind of professional disagreement that resolves itself once both people are looking at the same information with the same intent. CoreSite's reading Pump 2B as nominal, Curtis. I'm hearing something in that bearing that doesn't match nominal, and it doesn't match the noise profile of anything else running clean on that loop. The systems had 18 months of continuous data on that exact pump, Sam. If there were a genuine anomaly, it would show up in the trend. Not if you moved the threshold recently. Has anything changed in the sensitivity calibration this year? I watched something shift in my brother's face in that moment, a half-second hesitation he covered quickly, but not quickly enough for someone who spent 33 years reading small, involuntary tells for a living. There was a routine recalibration in January. Standard statistical refinement. Nothing that would meaningfully change flagging behavior on a pump with this operating history. I didn't believe him, not fully, and I want to be honest that what stopped me from pushing harder, in that exact conversation, wasn't professional restraint. It was 30 years of being the older brother who'd already spent a childhood correcting Curtis in front of people, and a genuine, complicated reluctance to do it again, in a control room, in front of his own engineering team, over what still felt, at that point, like it might reasonably be nothing more than an honest disagreement about statistical noise. I filed my manual inspection request through the standard maintenance queue instead of escalating further, and it sat there, deprioritized against core site's nominal reading, for 6 more weeks. Pump 2B's bearing failed catastrophically at 3:07 a.m. on a Tuesday in late June, 11 weeks after my initial manual concern report, and I want to be precise about what that failure actually meant, because I know how a story like this can sound in the retelling, and precision matters enormously here. Cardinal Ben's redundant safety systems performed exactly as designed. The failure triggered an automatic reactor trip on Unit 2, a controlled, safe shutdown sequence that every operator on that shift, myself included, executed without a single deviation from procedure. At no point during that night did Unit 2's reactor core, containment systems, or radiological safety margins come anywhere close to a threat to public safety. I want that stated plainly and without embellishment, because the story that matters here isn't a story about a plant that almost melted down. It's a story about how close an entirely preventable, costly, and professionally damaging failure came to being caught 11 weeks earlier, and precisely why it wasn't. I remember the specific sequence of sound that night better than I remember almost anything else from that entire year, the sharp mechanical shriek from the turbine building audible even through the control room's insulated walls, the cascading sequence of automated alarms lighting up the board in the exact order our training drills had rehearsed 100 times, and underneath all of it, my own voice calling out the shutdown sequence steps in a tone I recognized, with something like distant surprise, as perfectly calm, even as some other part of my mind was already running the arithmetic on exactly how many weeks it had been since April. The bearing failure, once inspected, showed exactly the pitting pattern I'd flagged in April, advanced, by 11 weeks, into a full mechanical failure that could have been caught and corrected during a routine, low-cost maintenance stop, had core site sensitivity not been adjusted specifically to reduce the frequency of exactly this category of maintenance stop ahead of a regulatory filing. I was in the control room when the trip occurred, working night shift the way I had for 3 decades, and I remember the specific, sinking certainty I felt the moment the alarm sequence started, before I even confirmed which system had triggered it. I already knew. Cardinal Ben's internal event review, required under standard nuclear regulatory protocol for any unplanned reactor trip, took 6 weeks, and it was thorough in a way that I think surprised Curtis more than it surprised me. My April concern report, sitting unresolved in the maintenance queue for 11 weeks, became the central document in that review, alongside an audit trail showing the January threshold adjustment and the internal memo justifying it. The review found no evidence that Curtis had personally falsified any data or directly ordered the suppression of a known safety concern, a distinction that mattered enormously to the outcome, and one I want to be fair about, because it would have been easy, in the version of this story I might have told a year ago in anger, to flatten that distinction into something simpler and less honest. What the review did find was that Curtis had approved a threshold adjustment specifically motivated by regulatory rate case optics, without adequately validating that adjustment against the plant's newer equipment vendors' distinct failure signatures, and had subsequently failed to escalate my manual concern report with the urgency the plant's own safety culture procedures required, in what the report's language described as an environment where operational efficiency metrics were permitted to inappropriately influence engineering risk tolerance. I sat across from the review panel myself, for the better part of an afternoon, answering questions about the April conversation I'd had with my own brother, watching 2 investigators I'd never met before take careful notes on a family relationship neither of them had any real way of understanding beyond what the transcript could show them. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission's own follow-up inspection, triggered automatically by any reportable reactor trip, concurred with Cardinal Ben's internal findings and issued a formal notice of violation regarding the plant's maintenance threshold governance process, not the kind of violation that shuts a plant down, but exactly the kind that follows a utility into every subsequent regulatory proceeding for years, including, as it happened, the rate case hearing the threshold adjustment had originally been made to protect. The hearing itself, when it finally occurred 5 months later than originally scheduled, produced a substantially less favorable outcome for the utility than Curtis's original efficiency projections had promised, a fact that several people at the plant were not shy about pointing out to him in the months that followed, sometimes with more cruelty than I was comfortable watching happen to my own brother, whatever his mistakes. Curtis was reassigned, 6 weeks after the review concluded, from Chief Digital Systems Officer to a technical advisory role with no direct authority over safety-critical system calibration, a demotion in every meaningful sense, delivered with enough procedural neutrality that neither of us ever had to say the word out loud to each other. Curtis and I didn't speak, beyond professional necessity, for almost 4 months after the trip. What finally broke that silence wasn't an apology, exactly, though I think it functioned as one. He asked to walk Unit 2's coolant loop with me, on a Saturday when neither of us was scheduled, just the two of us, the way our father used to walk this same plant with both of us as boys, before either of us had any idea we'd end up spending our careers here. I told myself the threshold change was sound statistics, he said, standing near the same pump housing that had failed 4 months earlier, now replaced with equipment CoreSite's models had since been retrained to properly recognize. I don't think that was a lie, exactly. I think I wanted it to be true badly enough that I stopped checking as carefully as I should have. I should have escalated past the maintenance queue the same day you hesitated in that conversation, Curtis. I've known you my whole life. I saw that hesitation, and I let being your brother talk me out of trusting what I saw. Would it have gone differently if you weren't my brother? I don't know. I'd like to think so. I think that's a question I'm going to be sitting with for a long time regardless of what I'd like to believe about myself. Neither of us resolved that question that afternoon, and I don't think either of us has fully resolved it since. What changed, concretely, is smaller and more procedural than either of us might have wanted a year ago. Cardinal Bend now requires any predictive maintenance threshold adjustment to undergo independent safety review, separated entirely from the engineering team proposing the change, with mandatory validation against every equipment vendor's documented failure signature before deployment. It's a bureaucratic fix to what was, underneath the bureaucracy, a human problem, the same human problem, I suspect, that shows up in some form in every industry where the pressure to look efficient on paper quietly competes with the discipline required to actually be safe in practice. I still walk Unit 2's coolant loop twice a week, the same as I have for 33 years, listening for the specific harmonic irregularity that no system, however well calibrated, has ever fully replaced my own trained ear for catching. CoreSite still runs, better now, more honestly calibrated, catching real problems the review process would have caught eventually anyway, just slower and at greater cost. I don't think the system was ever the failure in this story. I think the failure was in what we let the system be quietly asked to protect, for 11 weeks, before a bearing finally told the truth a threshold had been adjusted specifically not to hear.